Courage is the great enabling virtue that allows one to realize other virtues like love and hope and faith. To have courage is to be willing to look unflinchingly at catastrophic circumstances and muster the will to overcome the fear, never to fully erase and eliminate the fear, but overcome the fear so that fear does not have the last word, or so that fear does not push one into conformity, complacency, or cowardice.
A black problem ain't necessarily that it happens to a black person, but that people of color who have understood the historic forces of degradation can identify with other people who are similarly arrayed in the global landscape. We have to have what Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. and Fannie Lou Hamer and Ella Baker had, and that is a global perspective. They were revolutionary internationalists because they understood what goes on somewhere else has an effect here.
What's up, everybody? This is your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga, here to bring you another video with no frills, just the analysis. And oh man, you know what time it is. You know what time it is when you hear the brother Cornel West speaking about courage, and you hear the brother Michael Eric Dyson talking about global revolutionary internationalism. You know what time it is, baby. Yes, it is time for another segment in my series, my political consciousness series, Fuck You and Thank You. So, for those of you who don't know what this segment is about, I basically talk about various human rights issues around the world. Sometimes they can just involve human rights issues, like in my last video I talked about the famine that happened, or that's actually still happening in the Horn of Africa. Or I talk about human rights abuses, which I'll talk about today, a little bit later on. And I basically talk about human rights issues and abuses around the world. They're generally contemporary, so within the last 10 years, although I do provide some historical context that may go back, in today's case, that'll go back at least 100 years. And then that's the fuck you segment. The thank you segment is my segment where I talk about either an individual or, a group of people who are involved in some sort of political activism or human rights activism around the world. And so let's start it off. Today I'm going to be talking about the sort of horrible human rights conditions that's going on in Italy right now with, African immigrants and the way they're being economically exploited for their labor. And I'm also going to be talking about the human rights activist Liu Xiaobo, who's from China. But before I get into this video, let me just say two things. The first one is that this video is going to be pretty long, so prepare yourself. And if it gets too long, I'll say if it goes past 50 minutes, I'll probably have to break the video up into parts. Otherwise, you guys would be watching the equivalent of a movie or some sort of History Channel segment. But we'll see how it goes in with respect to time. Also, let me just address someone who watched my video the last time I put out a video in this segment, and that's the Rainbow Tribe. And he brought up some very good points. And if you're watching this, Rainbow Tribe, I haven't forgot about you. And so let me just say this. He basically said that I shouldn't pretend as if America has some sort of monopoly on human rights and portray American culture as being superior to every other culture. And I should watch out for sounding, hypocritical. But I have, a couple of responses to this. Of course, I take what he's saying, as an honest critique of what I'm doing. But let me just, say this. The purpose of these videos is to review the culture that I'm talking about and the context in which these human rights abuses occur. Now, of course, that's not going to be, a complete completely accurate depiction of the culture that I'm talking about. After all, I'm not an expert in these various cultures. But for what I'm trying to do, which is to highlight very specific human rights abuses, which you know, I mean, human rights is something that's just not controversial. You're either engaging in certain human rights abuses or you aren't. It's not like a hot button political issue like, you know, abortion or the death penalty that's just confined to, you know, one particular nation. I'm talking about this with an international perspective. And these are human rights abuses. And when I say human rights abuses, I mean abuses that happen to a group of people on a large scale. So it has to be a segment of society or even an entire population. And so the things that I'm talking about tend to be non-controversial. And so if I try and portray America as being superior to other cultures, that's number one, not my intention. And number two, as far as I can tell, I don't think that there are any real human rights abuses inside of America. Now, some people may claim that, you know, the way the Bush administration treated war detainees, for example, may constitute certain human rights abuses. But I don't think that they are on the scale of the human rights that I'm talking about. For example, you know, the Civil War that I'll be talking about that just happened in the Ivory Coast. The way, you know, the African immigrants are being treated in Italy that I'm going to be talking about later on, and you know the famine that I talked about in my last video in the Horn of Africa. So I think that's a very important distinction to make between you know my American culture and some of the things that are happening on a larger scale outside of America. So you know that's pretty much it. So like I said, today I'm going to be talking about the conditions that constitute modern-day slavery with respect to the African immigrants in Italy. And I'm going to be talking about Liu Xiaobo, who's a human rights activist in China. So first, let me just provide you with some historical context with respect to the situation that's going on in Italy. For those of you who don't know, the nations in Europe tend to be, at least in Western Europe, tend to be fairly homogenous. And they tend to be fairly, and this is true from both a cultural standpoint and an ethnic standpoint. And so they tend to be homogenous to the extent that they have a linguistic affinity, like, you know, French people, you know, speak French. And that's sort of like, you know, the established national language of France. They tend to have the same history. They tend to come from a group of people who have been in that particular region for hundreds or even, you know, maybe even 1,000 years in some cases. And with the formation of the modern nation state, Western European countries developed a sort of national identity, and that national identity was forged by having certain ethnic commonalities. And so I think that the racism that you would experience in Western Europe tends to be a little bit worse than in America. And the reason why I say that is because America, the formation of the American nation state happened within a context of a sort of confluence of various cultures and ethnicities. And for, you know, a very long time in the South, at least in, you know, the slaveholding South, there were a couple of instances where the African American population actually outnumbered the Caucasian or the white population. White is sort of a complicated term. And so America has had to go through a long history of integrating difference. And as a result, America tends to be a more pluralistic society than what you would see in the sort of Western European nations. And as a result, at least from my perspective, I think that the racism that you would experience in America would be probably a little bit less than the racism that you would experience in other European nations who are just now having to go through this process of opening up their borders and allowing, confronting the possibility of allowing other people who are, you know, different from them into their nation. And so in Italy, just to give you a sort of demographic breakdown, about 92.5% of the people who live in Italy identify themselves ethnically as Italian, whereas 1.5% of the Italian population, or at least the people who live within Italy, are classified as African. And, that is starkly different from America. Because I think in America, only about 65 or 66% is Caucasian. Of the population is Caucasian, while the other 1/3 is, comprised of various ethnicities. And even though that may seem a little lopsided now, the trajectory of the American demographics within the next 30, 40, or even 50 years is really going to change that lopsidedness. I think the estimates are now that sometime in 2050 or 2060 that Caucasians will be in the minority. So again, that's just another aspect of how America has had to go through a longer and more intense process of incorporating various ethnicities into its national makeup. So now let me talk about, the problem in Italy. The problem in Italy is partially caused by the Northern League, which is a sort of political party in Italy that was founded by somebody named Umberto Bossi. And basically, the Northern League, as its name implies, tries to consolidate the northern part of Italy against the southern part of Italy. And the reason why there's this sort of friction or, well, basically, friction or tension between the north and the south part of Italy is that the northern part of Italy tends to be more developed than the southern part of Italy. And so what happens is the northern part of Italy, when they say that they want to consolidate and they want autonomy and they want to, separate away from the southern part, what they really mean is that they want economic autonomy because they see the south as an economic drain on the more advanced or more developed northern part of Italy. The Northern League is also fiercely anti-immigrant, especially towards, but mostly and especially towards non-European immigrants. They see immigrants as, again, an economic drain. They see them as, taking away jobs from Italians. They see the problem of illegal immigration with, from an economic standpoint, as being detrimental to Italian society. But also they see the increase in African immigration as a threat to their national identity. And this is oftentimes couched in both ethnic and in religious terms. So they tend to have a more positive view of European immigrants because they see them as being Christian, whereas they tend to be against African immigrants because they see them as Muslim, and they see, that the Muslim religion or the Islamic religion. Muslim is a person who is a believer in Islam or who practices Islam. Islam is the religion. They see people who are Muslim as a threat to their religious identity as a nation, i.e. their Christian identity. And I know up until very recently, up until the Berlusconi government was dissolved, they had 4 cabinet members. So they actually are a political party that holds a considerable amount of power within Italian politics, both in the north and on the larger national scale. So southern Italy, because it's less developed, it tends to rely on sort of, labor that they rely on labor related to agriculture. So it's sort of akin to the way, and sad to say this, it's sort of akin to the way Americans view Mexican immigrants. They see them as, day laborers, people working in either construction or, the agricultural sector. So this is the sort of same way that the Italian, at least Southern Italians, and to a large extent even Northern Italians, view African immigrants. They just see them as, agricultural labor and day laborers, things of that nature. And however, even though the Southern Italians and even to a much greater extent, Northern Italians tend to see African immigrants in a rather negative light, they still understand that they need African immigrants. Because they are an important component, whether or not they would like to admit this. African immigrants are actually a very important component of the Italian economy. And so there's this sort of symbiotic relationship that's developed, at least in economic terms. The African immigrants need the work supplied by Southern Italy, and Southern Italy needs the workers, i.e. the African immigrants, insofar as they represent an important component of the Italian economy. And this relationship is sort of complicated by the racial and ethnic sort of tension within Italian society. And this is even more complicated by the mafia, which is something that I was, rather struck by. I didn't believe, or at least I didn't know, that the mafia still had this much power in Italy, or at least organized crime had so much power in Italy. So this is already a somewhat, highly tense racial situation, and in a large sense, a sort of racist context. Insofar as the Italians tend to look down on Africans and African immigrants as their racial inferiors. But this is also complicated by the sort of organized crime in Italy, and the way organized crime exploits the labor of these African immigrants. And this is the specific term for this, and I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to pronounce this correctly, but the specific term for this is called caporalato. So it's basically, caporalato is basically a system of economic exploitation. It involves the hiring of both legal but also illegal immigrants. And this is not confined to just Africans, but also to Asians and Eastern Europeans, although Africans tend to receive the brunt of the sort of racist attacks leveled by both Northern and Southern Italians. And so basically what happens is that these immigrants wait in a particular location, and then the mafia comes and picks them up, and they take them to the factory, or they take them to the farm, or etc. But the dimension of economic exploitation comes in because these people, these African immigrants, are basically wage slaves. There are about 550,000, workers a year. There's no regulation of this sort of, organized crime, or this sort of segment of the Italian economy, which means that there's going to be low wages. And on top of that, the mafia generally takes anywhere between 50 to 60% of any of the wages that the African immigrants get. The African immigrants also tend to live in largely segregated societies, communities rather. So they're segregated from the larger society. They are isolated from the police. And, they can't really go to the police for help if they're here illegally, because obviously they'll be deported. And even if they go to the police, and they're here legally, they suffer repercussions from the mafia, who obviously doesn't like the police snooping around into their business. African immigrants also work under horrible conditions. They suffer beatings and violence from the mafia, from the people that they work for. They tend to work anywhere between 10 and 14 hours a day. And I know for some of us, 8 hours a day seems horrible, but imagine working in a factory or in a field picking, vegetables hunched over in a field for 10 to 14 hours a day. African immigrants also tend to live in substandard housing. So some of them live in abandoned factories that have no water, no electricity, no sanitation, no heat. So obviously these sort of segregated communities are at a higher or increased risk of disease and the spread of diseases. And for those of you who don't know, there was, at least, well, not recently. I tend to think that the 2010 was rather recent, but there was actually race riots that happened in the southern Italian town of Rosarno. There were race riots in 2010 that were about precisely these sort of working and living conditions in which the African immigrants a lot of the times found themselves, and they were sparked by, you know, what happened in this Rosarno, this southern Italian farming town. So on January 7th of 2010, some African immigrants were shot with air rifles. And, you know, this is actually a common occurrence for African immigrants to be basically attacked or otherwise harassed by other Italians. And on January 9th, this sort of situation escalated because two African immigrants were killed, and they were, you know, basically beaten with iron bars. And, you know, this prompted a massive blow up, prompted a huge race riots where, you know, African immigrants destroyed buildings and smashed cars, and it was basically you know, not a good situation. And I know that the Berlusconi government, or there was some legislation introduced into the Italian Congress, but I haven't been able to figure out what the status of that legislation is. And even if there's legislation in the Italian Congress, there obviously needs to be more done than just, you know, this token legislation. They actually need to, you know, crack down on the mafia, and more than crack down on the mafia, they have to basically, the Italian society has to come to a position where it can look itself in the face and critique the way it treats ethnic minorities within its society. So and you know, this and when I say, you know, that the Italian society is racist, I mean that very literally. The slurs, I mean, it's to the point where Italian politicians can use racial slurs against African immigrants without any sort of, you know, repercussions. And there was actually a huge dust up in the media, at least in, you know, our country and in other Western European countries, where a politician referred to African immigrants as bingo bongos. Now that may not sound like a slur to us, but in Italian, it's a phrase that basically denotes that someone is, you know, an animal, that they're not a real human being. And so this is, you know, basically, you know, my fuck you segment of the video. And so there needs to be real reform so that they can deal with in a more humane way the problem of not just, you know, illegal immigration, but also the sort of racist context of southern Italy and of northern Italy for that matter. All right, so now I want to talk about Liu Xiaobo. My nigga Liu Xiaobo. So first, just like I did for, you know, Italy, let me give you a sort of, you know, context, for a sort of cultural and historical context for understanding the current situation in China that's been going on for, I believe the Communist Party has been in power for at least the last 60 years. So let me give you some sort of context for that. Up until about 1910 or 1911, China had been ruled by a series of emperors. It was sort of based on dynastic rule. And in 1911, the Qing, I believe that's how you pronounced it, the Qing dynasty, their rule basically collapsed. And this started a sort of skirmish for power, and there was a fight between the warlords who wanted to take over and basically fragment China, the Chinese nation state, not nation state, but the Chinese territory, into a series of fiefdoms. And so basically what happened was Chinese nationalists and Chinese communists joined forces to sort of fight the warlords so that they could turn China into a sort of modern nation state, and implement a sort of government and, you know, some sort of bureaucratic system of rule. So the focus of the nationalists and the communists was to fight the warlords in China in order to unite China as a whole. However, there was a split within. There was a split between what eventually became known as the KMT. I forget what that acronym stands for, but they were basically the nationalists, and the CPC, who were basically the communists. And this is basically the origins of the Chinese Civil War, because between 1932 and 1936, the KMT, the nationalists, actually attacked the CPC, or the communists. And so political and military battle lines were drawn, and so basically a civil war ensued between the nationalists in China and the Chinese communists. During this fight, there was where the KMT was sort of attacking the communists. There were two prominent armies. One was led by Zhang Guotou, and the other was led by Mao Zedong, who we all know, or at least some of you, a lot of you, should have heard of Mao Zedong. The KMT attacked both of those armies, and their main focus, however, was on Zhang Guotou, because he had the larger army. His army was, I believe, significantly larger than Mao Zedong's, and they sort of focused on destroying Zhang Guotou's army. And in the process of that happening, Mao Zedong was able to implement a successful retreat in what's now known as the Long March. The Long March was basically a retreat that spanned 12.5 kilometers, basically, where Mao Zedong basically had to march his army over a period of 12.5 kilometers in order to get away from the nationalist attack on the communists, on the communists. And that's basically how Mao Zedong became the leader of the communists. I'm not sure if it was the Communist Party at that time, but basically the Communist Party. Like I said, the nationalists destroyed Zhang Guotou's army, and Mao Zedong was able to retreat, and his army was left largely intact. And as Mao Zedong would later go on to say, politics is what comes out of the barrel of a gun. So since he had the larger army, he basically took over the Communist Party. Now, this sort of civil war between the nationalists and the communists was sort of interrupted by World War II. So during World War II, they actually had to work together against the Japanese. Work together against the Japanese. And however, after World War II was over, there was an initial truce that I believe lasted maybe 1 year or 2 years, something like that. But it didn't last very long. Actually, I think it might have been 1 to 2 years, not sure. But there was an initial truce. But after that, the Civil War resumed, and the communists quickly gained the upper hand, and they basically destroyed the KMT, or the Chinese nationalists. And in 1949, and here's something that I didn't even know this. In 1949, 2 different Chinas were established. And I know that sounds crazy, but one is called the Republic of China, which is Taiwan. And the other one is actually called the People's Republic of China, which is the communist China that we know. And of course, there's still, this a lot of enmity between the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, which is Taiwan. And both governments refuse to recognize the sovereignty of the other. China, the China that we know, the communist China, regards Taiwan as a sort of, sort of in rebellion, and they actually believe that Taiwan is the property of the Chinese government, and that they're sort of engaged in a rebellion. Although the Civil War officially ended either in 1949 or 1950. I believe it was 1949 though. So in 1949, Mao Zedong comes to power as not only the leader of the Communist Party, but as the de facto leader of the Chinese government. And of course, there's one-party rule, so everyone who's, politically opposed to them has their freedom stripped away from them, are turned into political dissidents, and basically, hunted down and summarily executed and, wiped out of the national political scene. It's pretty brutal, but that's basically what happened after Mao Zedong came to power. And just to give you some sort of idea of what Mao Zedong's rule was like, between 1958 and 1962, Mao Zedong decided to implement what's known as, the Great Leap Forward, which resulted, unfortunately, in the largest famine to ever happen in world history. What Mao Zedong wanted to do as part of, his communist ideology was to transform China from an agrarian society into a modern society. And so his way of doing that, part of his way of doing that, or part of the way that he tried to do that, was to implement a program of, collective agriculture, where, large communities of people would farm the land together, and food would be, rationed out to people as needed. So the government, came in, took over, all the farmland, implemented like communities of people to farm the land, and then ration out the food. The problem with this, however, was that the agricultural practices that the government used were highly unscientific, and as a result, the grain production decreased dramatically. So there wasn't enough food. There's some historical debate about how much Mao Zedong knew and how much the Chinese government's of Chinese officials actually knew. But what is clear is that the Chinese officials who were in charge of overseeing this project exaggerated the numbers. So they were saying that the grain production was increasing when it was really decreasing, which caused the famine. And it's estimated that, and this is a very conservative number. The most conservative number that I found is that at least 18 million people died in this famine, but the largest number that I found suggests that as many as 46 million people died. So we're talking about anywhere between 18 million and 46 million people died as a result of, the mismanagement of the government run by, Mao Zedong and the people that he put in charge of this project. So, this is the context into which, Liu Xiaobo is born. He's born into this context of, a system governed by one-party rule, which is, communist rule. People are stripped of their ability to protest against the government. They're stripped of their freedom. They're executed. They are, imprisoned. And they basically don't, this is a situation in China where, a vast majority of the people live their lives without, political rights of any real political rights of any kind. So Liu Xiaobo is an internationally renowned literary critic, writer, and human rights activist. He's authored 15 books. And he's mostly known for his literary criticism and politics. But as of right now, all of his books are banned in China. So they've basically, put the kibosh on all of his books. In 1987, I believe he got his PhD in 1986, but in 1987, I believe is when he officially left China to be a professor in various places around the world. And however, he did return to China in 1989 for the Tiananmen protests, which is what he's most famous for as a human rights activist. And I know a lot of you have probably heard about the Tiananmen protests, but the Tiananmen protests basically happened as a response to the death of Hu Yaobang. The Tiananmen protests are known as the June 4th incident, or the Tiananmen massacre. And Tiananmen Square is a large city square in the middle of Beijing, which is the capital of China. And these protests occurred in April of 89, and led up to this June 4th incident. And it became Tiananmen Square became the site of massive protests by students and other intellectuals. The area surrounding Tiananmen Square, because Tiananmen Square is not actually that big, so the people in Tiananmen Square only numbered in the thousands. But outside in the surrounding areas and towns and cities around Tiananmen Square, there were protests by hundreds of thousands of people. So the Tiananmen Square itself was only part of a larger movement of protests. Like I said, these protests were sparked by the death of Hu Yaobang, who was considered to be a reformer within the Chinese Communist Party. So some of the things that he wanted was to increase the transparency of the Communist Party and the Chinese government overall. He wanted political reforms. He wanted to make the political process in China more democratic. And so when he died, like I said, hundreds of thousands of people gathered to celebrate his life and to protest the sort of inhumane practices and the undemocratic practices of the Chinese government. So the Tiananmen protest was a non-violent mass movement for political reform. That's basically what it was in a nutshell. It was comprised of students and intellectuals who wanted economic freedom. They wanted democracy. They wanted all of the basic political rights that come along with democracy, the right to protest, freedom of speech, etc. And they wanted an establishment of, the rule of law. They basically were protesting against the Chinese government's use of the military to crack down on protesters and political dissidents. However, on May 20th, the Chinese government, saw that, the protests were getting out of hand and that they wouldn't be able to contain it. So they declared martial law. And this, directly leads into what's known as the June 4th massacre, which is, another name for the Tiananmen Square protests. So this didn't happen directly in Tiananmen Square, but rather in the surrounding areas, because like I said, Tiananmen Square itself is apparently, not that big. And so the protests were in Tiananmen, but also around Tiananmen. When the protesters refused to abide by martial law, the Chinese military, which is known as the People's Liberation Army, I know, right? Quite an ironic name, the People's Liberation Army. They basically went into Tiananmen and the area surrounding Tiananmen, and they shot protesters. They drove in with tanks, and some of you may know. a person who's, you know, known as Tank Man, who we don't know who he is, but there's a very famous video clip of a man, you know, standing in front of a tank. And so, you know, some of you might know Tank Man. I'll link, put a link in the description box below so you can, you know, see that video clip of a man basically, you know, fighting for his rights and, you know, willing to stand in front of a tank in order to, you know, get not only his freedom but the freedom of, you know, everyone else in China. So, you know, several hundred to several thousand people died in the protest. However, on, you know, June 4th, Liu Xiaobo and three other men who were in charge of the protest and who were seen as the sort of, you know, intellectual figureheads of the protest. They were able to negotiate the nonviolent withdrawal of the students from Tiananmen and the area surrounding Tiananmen Square. And these men are known as the Four Junzi. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. Probably not. And Junzi is a concept from Confucius, from the philosophy of Confucianism, which is Confucius' idea of what he called the ideal human. So the fact that these men are named Junzi, Liu Xiaobo, in addition to three other men, is a sort of, you know, honorable title bestowed upon him for his ability to negotiate the nonviolent withdrawal of the students from Tiananmen in the area surrounding Tiananmen Square. So like I said, that's the sort of most famous activism that Liu Xiaobo is known for, but he's also famous for Charter 8. He helped to write what's known as Charter 8, which is a document outlining 19 demands against the Chinese government. And among these demands are political reform, obviously, to get rid of the one-party communist rule in China, economic reform to basically open up China to capitalism and to stop communism, democracy, and those are the types of demands that, you know, Liu Xiaobo helped to come up with in writing the document. And here's a quote from Charter 8 that reads, "Equality and human rights are universal common values shared by all mankind, and democracy, a republic, and constitutionalism constitute the basic structural framework of modern governance. A modernization bereft of these universal values and this basic political framework is a disastrous process that deprives humans of their rights, corrodes human nature, and destroys human dignity." And right now, Liu Xiaobo is currently in prison. He's been in prison 4 times. So the first 3 times that he was in prison amounted to about 5 years and 3 months. However, in 2009, he was sentenced to 11 years. So unfortunately, he'll be in prison until, you know, 2020. However, in 2010, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his commitment to political activism and human rights activism in China. So basically, I just want to say to Liu Xiaobo and for everything that he's done for not only Chinese society, but for the world at large. Thank you for your service. Your service on behalf of human rights and human freedoms is greatly appreciated. So, you know, like I said before in my last video, oh, also some good news. There were 2 permanent people on my fuck you list. One of them was Omar Bashir, who helped orchestrate a genocide in Darfur that killed up to 300 to 400,000 people, and Kim Jong-il, who was the dictator of North Korea. But fortunately for us, and yes, I am rejoicing, Kim Jong-il died, so he's removed from my permanent fuck you list. So the only member now of the permanent fuck you list is, like I said, Omar Bashir. So like I said before in my last video, to everybody that stands in the path of human freedom and human rights, fuck you. And to everybody who is in the struggle for human freedom and human rights, thank you. Your service is greatly appreciated. So this was your boy Uber Hikari, aka the Nerd Nigga. Just brought you another video with no frills, just the analysis. Peace and have a blessed day.